to the heart and take me on a journey of letting go, getting lost in you.
Well, hey, National Park Church, we're here for our second week of our study in the book of James. Looking forward to this continual reflection on an immensely practical book, a book that challenges us not merely to think about our faith, not to think about what it means to be a Christian, but to put that into action. That James is always pushing for the manifestation of our convictions in everyday life. And so, as I said last week, I got the idea of doing this study from just scrolling through Facebook, and someone said, man, in the time that we're in right now, we really need to reflect on the book of James. And so I wanted us to do that together. And this morning we're going to talk a little bit about wisdom, thinking through the concept of wisdom, particularly as it pertains to the book of James. But I want to we're going to start with this video by one of the leading New Testament scholars, N.T. Wright. And he's specifically talking more about the Apostle Paul, but he's talking in general, the New Testament, this idea of virtue and character. And I want to play this video because I think it's the foundation for when we discuss wisdom. Because what N.T. Wright's going to argue for is that the Christian community is not primarily about forming a group of people that have all the right answers. Of course, he thinks doctrine's important, and he thinks thinking theologically matters, but the very people that are being formed are a kind of people of a particular character and virtue. And this is really, really important because he assumes that you're becoming a kind of person when you connect yourself with the community of Jesus, that it's very interested in forming the kind of character and the kind of way in which you want to be in the world. And that's going to be deeply connected when we think about wisdom, because as we're going to talk about, wisdom is not primarily about accumulating a bunch of right answers. It is learning to discern how to act in particular and even unique situations the way that Jesus intends for us to act. So I want us to lay the foundation with this idea of the Christian community as a forming of people of character and virtue, and then we'll come back and discuss James together. So let's watch this video together.
Many Christians today, when they think about Christian behavior, think in terms of a set of rules, that you're supposed to do these things and not do those things, and that you just have to grit your teeth and struggle to do it. And if you don't seem to be able to make it, well, you say, I guess I'm just failing on that one, or whatever it is. That wasn't how Paul saw Christian ethics at all. For Paul, what mattered was the transformation of character. Now, Paul lived in a world where the philosophers had talked about the transformation of character for years. In Greece, where we are here, Plato and Aristotle and many other thinkers had talked about the virtues. They had seen that it's possible to think of a fully human character, a contented, happy, wise human being. And they had realized that just as you have to train your body if you're going to be a good athlete, or you have to train particular muscles and practices if you're going to be a musician, or you have to learn vocabulary if you're picking up a new language, so it is with character and behavior. There are certain skills you can practice which you can then put together, and gradually you become the person that you wanted to become. Now, there's a difference between that and what Paul and the other early Christians taught, because for the ancient Greeks and the Romans, virtue was basically a solo sport. It was me making myself a better human being. And it was always about me striving to do better and to be better. Whereas for Paul and the early Christians, first it was always a team sport, because at the heart of the Christian character were love and kindness and gentleness and things like that, which you can't basically do by yourself. You need to do them with other people. But also, it was as though this idea of character formation had been taken out of one's own self-striving and had become part of God's gift by the gospel. But here's the strange thing, which many people in our world find so difficult to get hold of. When Paul talks about the Holy Spirit and the work of the Spirit through the gospel, he talks about us becoming more human, not less, which means that our faculties are enhanced and we are enabled to think about what we do and to take choices which will actually transform our characters bit by bit. So that what we have in Paul and in the New Testament in general is a character transformation by the gospel and the Spirit, which somehow enables us to make the right choices bit by bit, to learn the Christian character strengths, which are making us not into these lonely, proud individuals, such as you might have got from an Aristotelian virtue ethic, but rather to be wise, humble, kind, brave, loving people, such as Paul is indicating again and again. So that, for instance, when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, many people today think, well, if the Spirit's going to do that in me, all I have to do is hang loose and let the Spirit do it. But the last one in that list gives the game away, because self-control is by definition not something that just happens to you when you're just dozing. It's about you taking control of your own self, of your own character, of this process. And just as fruit grows on a tree, but if the gardener isn't careful, there'll be predators, there will be ivy, there'll be other things which will attack the tree, bad weather, whatever it is, and the gardener has to look after it and nourish it. So it is with the fruit of the Spirit. And this is how character develops. And for Paul, that character development always also includes suffering. People often say today, oh, if it doesn't come naturally, it can't be right, it's inauthentic. For Paul, no, it's always going to be a struggle. And the authenticity is what happens at the end of the process, not at the beginning. Perhaps the best example of all this is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is a famous poem about love. Love is gentle and kind, and so on. It's often read out at weddings. But towards the end of that passage, there's a fascinating little riff where Paul contrasts the way we are at present with the way we will be one day in the future. He says, now I see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know even as also I am known. What has this got to do with love? The answer is that he's thinking about the new creation. Love is the language that they speak in the new creation, and we get to learn and practice it now. Love is the song that they sing in the new creation, and we get to learn and to try to sing it now and to figure out the harmonies and all the rest of it. In other words, love is not simply a duty, it is our destiny. It's what we were made for. It's the very heart of our humanness, and we get to practice it now. That's how we can retrieve the ancient idea of virtue, although it is completely transformed because the gospel, by the work of the Spirit, enables us, by grace, to take the decisions through which we become the God-reflecting human beings that we were made to be in the first place.
It seems to me that N.T. Wright lays out something that a little bit different than what maybe we typically think of as the role of the church. One, I think his point about this is not primarily an individual experience, that this is something that we do together collectively, is drastically different than kind of what I grew up with, or at least I perceived that I grew up with. I thought my primary task is for me individually to connect myself with God and to be the best disciple I can be individually, but to actually my participation in the community itself is an essential part of what discipleship is. That the community doesn't merely exist to help me on my individual journey. It's my participation in the mission and purpose of the community that allows me to become an integral part of what God is trying to do. And that becomes the foundation for what James says in chapter 1, starting in verse 5. I'll read it and then we'll process it together. James says, If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So there's a couple of things that I want us to talk about in relation to this idea, this concept. Number one, I think we need to ask the question, what does it mean by doubting? That can be a bit off-putting, right? The first part is very encouraging. Hey, just ask for wisdom, and if you ask for wisdom, God is very much prepared to give that to you. But then James quickly moves into this conversation about doubting and says if you doubt, then it's not going to be given to you. He insinuates that you can't have doubt and also simultaneously ask for wisdom. So what does that mean? What is he getting at, and what does that mean for you and me? Because I've confessed it in classes and from the pulpit that I'm not a person that never wrestles with doubt or has questions about what God's doing and what God's up to and what it means to be a Christian. So what is meant by doubt here? And I think unpacking that is really, really important. So when you and I think about doubt, probably what we think is we doubt the existence of God, or our doubts arise from very philosophical and theological questions like the problem of evil. How can an all-powerful and good and loving God create a world where there's evil in it? And those things cause us to doubt, to ask questions, to wonder what is happening. And I don't think that's what James is primarily engaging with, because he's talking about being double-minded. And so my guess is it's probably closer to doubting that the way of God, that the path and the wisdom of God is true wisdom and the way that life should actually be lived. Let me try to flesh that out a little bit more. If you read the Apostle Paul, especially in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, what he talks about is that the way of the cross, the way of Jesus, seems like foolishness. He says specifically to the Greeks, to Gentiles, and it's a stumbling block to the Jews. So this way of the cross, this way of love that is self-sacrificial, seems like a stumbling block and like foolishness to the rest of the world. And there seems to be this contrast. Are you going to take the self-sacrificial love of Jesus, or are you going to take the path of the world? That oftentimes the path of Jesus seems like folly, seems counterintuitive to how the world works. And so what I think James is getting at here is he's saying, you have to decide, because there's going to be times where the wisdom of God is portrayed to you, and it's going to look like foolishness to the world. And when that happens, if you're double-minded, if you're constantly in tension on, am I really wanting to go the path of God, or do I actually want to participate in the wisdom of the world? If you're constantly caught in that tension, if you're never willing to commit, if you're never willing to walk in that trust that the way of God, even when it sounds peculiar and strange and counterintuitive, is the path where life is found. If you're constantly in this struggle of trying to straddle the fence of, I want to have some of the wisdom of the world and some of the wisdom of God, if you're in that in between, you're going to be unable to fully embrace and experience the wisdom that God has for you. Because think about it, even just the very wisdom of God as embodied most fully in Jesus Christ. The early Christians described Jesus as the embodiment of the wisdom that is talked about in Proverbs. So they associated wisdom as talked about in Proverbs with Jesus. Jesus is the incarnation of that wisdom. But you look at the life of Jesus and you look at a lot of the teachings of Jesus, and on the surface of them, they don't seem to lead to the things that we conventionally think are wise. For example, if you read Paul in Philippians chapter 2, the entire message of Paul's letter, specifically in chapter 2, is about the God who descends to the lowest point of human existence to be honored and glorified. Well, conventionally, when we think about the wise thing to do, what we would be taught is actually the exact opposite. The way we receive honor and glory and power and influence is if we climb the ladder to the top. And so we're confronted with what is really the wise move. Is the wise move to follow Jesus in this descent where serving and giving myself to another is actually the way in which I can experience the fullness of what I was intended to be? Or do I take the path that the world has laid out for me that says I need to seek my own, I need to seek my own prestige and my own honor and my own place of high status? And what James is getting at is if you pray, God will give you wisdom. But his wisdom is often going to feel like it's in contradiction to the wisdom that you see in the world. And if you do not actively decide which wisdom you're going to have your life coincide with, you're going to be tossed to and fro constantly. I think this is a really, really key point, because when we ask God for wisdom, we need to know that oftentimes the wisdom that's going to show up on the scene, the thing that's going to be told to us, is going to be deeply counterintuitive to our prior expectations of what I should do and how I should live. That when God gives us wisdom, we need to remember his wisdom is manifested most clearly in the one who headed to a cross, who expressed love through dying on a cross, which means that marks the kind of wisdom that you and I are going to be participating in. Paul, as we've already mentioned, lays it out. For us, probably the kind of wisdom that God's going to give us is going to feel initially like folly, like a mistake. Like, is that really the best way to live? Is that really for my good? Is that really a healthy and wise decision? So I think we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds. That's what is, when he's talking about doubting and being tossed to and fro, I think it's, are we going to trust that the wisdom of God is really the path to life? Or are we in a tension because we actually think the wisdom of the world may actually be a better path to life than the wisdom that is offered to us from God? But the second thing I want to talk about, I think, is in direct connection with the N.T. Wright video, because I want us to talk about this concept of wisdom. What does that look like and how does it manifest itself? And I think, number one, as N.T. Wright talked about, wisdom comes to a people that are being formed in a particular way. So it's not just isolated insights that God just showers upon us. That may come in the process of wisdom. But wisdom comes as a people, as we'll find later in the book of James, who are praying from a posture of, we want to be doers of the law. We want to be doers of the things that God has called us to. And as they participate in that way of life, there's going to be situations where there's no easy answer. There's no clear path to take. There's not an answer I can memorize that tells me this is how I should act in that particular situation. And I think that's where he says that's the space where you pray for wisdom. Maybe a good way to illustrate that is to go to probably the most famous text in Scripture with a practical application to the concept of wisdom. If you remember in the book of 1 Kings, there's the famous story of God basically tells Solomon, you can have anything that your heart desires. And you may think, well, he's going to ask for riches, or he's going to ask for power, or he's going to ask for influence, or he's going to ask for something of that nature. But what does he ask for? He asks for wisdom. Solomon says, give me wisdom. And we see that play out in a particular story where these two women come, they lived together, they had children born 3 days apart, and no one else was there when the babies were born. So they lived pretty isolated lives. One of the babies is killed during the sleep. A mom rolls over on the baby and the baby dies. So there's one child left. But both women are claiming that it's their child. Now, no one was there to witness it. No one was there to see it. No one was there to identify, well, this child belongs to this woman or belongs to this other woman. So how do you decipher that? How do you figure that out? Well, what Solomon can't do is he can't pick up some book and say, all right, this is the exact thing you do when two women come and are both claiming that this child is their own. There's There's no written answer that gives you, this is what you do in that situation. No, he has to use prudential wisdom to figure out, how do you decipher that? How do you figure out what to do in that circumstance? And so what does he do? He gets to the heart. How can I know which of these women is really the true mother? Well, I'm going to put them to the test. All right, here's our options. We can cut the baby in half, and we can give half to each one of you, because we're not going to be able to figure out who the mom of the baby is. Well, of course, the true mother says, absolutely not. She can have it. You do not do that. Anything to make sure that doesn't happen. The other mom says, sure, that's great. Then neither one of us will have a child. And so Solomon says, okay, the mom who is willing to give up her child to make sure that child has life is the true mother. But what's interesting is wisdom is manifested in situations like that. Wisdom is the kind of thing where you figure out what to do in complex and not easy answer circumstances. I think this is interesting and really important. God in Scripture seems a lot more interested in wisdom than memorizing right answers. I get asked in my position in ministry all the time, can you just what's the answer? What's the right answer here? Hey, can you give me the solution? What should I do? Just tell me what the answer is. And most of the time, life doesn't work that right way. Like, how many situations in your life is there a handbook that says, when a coworker tells me this is the 3 steps I should do, and that's the right answer to the question. Or when my spouse does this is the perfect right way to respond every time she or he acts in that particular way or says that particular thing. Most of life is not a set of answers or puzzles that I can solve. Most of them require an ability to have discernment of how to manifest the way of God in unique and particular situations. That part of being a Christian is not trying to walk in your life figuring out the right answers to every problem that you face, but to be the kind of person who says, God, give me discernment on how to manifest your love and your way of being in this particular situation. I'm afraid that many of us have probably not prayed enough asking God to make us wise people. We've assumed rather that we want to be a kind of people that have all the perfect, pristine answers. But probably in our complex and unique world, what we need more than anything is Christians that are deeply embedded with the wisdom of God. And the great thing about wisdom is it's not just the accumulation of knowledge. It's a kind of discernment to know, how do I do the next right thing? How do I act in this particular situation the way that God desires for me to act? And the beauty of what James says is, if you ask from a heart saying, God, I need you, I don't have all the answers to what I need to do in this particular situation, that God will come through the power of His Spirit and give you wisdom. He will give you discernment on how to engage in deeply complex situations. That one of His promises to His people is that He will give wisdom. So I encourage you, seek God out in that way. Ask Him to bestow wisdom upon you. And I think you'll find that it's an incredible gift. I hope you guys have a great week. Love you all. See you soon.